Leading up to the release of this abortion opinion, I gotta admit, I was getting pretty nervous. The weeks since the leak have dragged on. We've seen implied threats against the justices outside of their homes. We saw one actual murder threat, apparently thwarted by little more than the text messages of the would-be killer's sister. And we've seen reports in the interim that Roberts had been working behind the scenes to Roberts harder than he's ever Robertsed before, to swing a compromise opinion that invents new legal standards to find some non-existent common ground between the activists and the text of the Constitution. And then the opinion came out, and rightfully, none of that stuff mattered at all. Even better, the justices not only had the courage to stick with the law and their convictions, but the foresight to secure your gun rights the day prior in preparation for the unhinged reaction. As far as the majority opinion, it's the same thing that we saw with the leak last month. Alito did add a few sections to respond to some critiques from the dissent, but fundamentally, the logic and the substance of the opinion remain the same. And I already analyzed the leaked opinion in great detail last month, so I won't do that again, but I will link that video atop the description if you'd like to listen to that piece. The summary version of Alito's majority opinion is that the Constitution makes no reference to abortion, and the history of abortion laws in this country before Roe indicate that abortion is not a fundamental right that's deeply rooted in the country's history that would qualify it as an unenumerated or implied constitutional right. Absent any explicit reference or historical implication, abortion is not a constitutional issue. If it's not a constitutional issue, it is up to the states to decide. That is the quickest rundown of the decision that I can possibly give, and that speaks to the constitutional issue at stake, but it doesn't have as much to say about just how morally and legally significant this decision actually is. 50 years of the legal termination of innocent life will now come to an end across major portions of this country, and just as importantly, power is now restored to the people to navigate this issue for themselves. This isn't just a monumental moment for the rights of the unborn, though it is. It is also a monumental moment for you, the adult citizen, to craft policy in your state according to your own conscience and the conscience of your neighbors, not according to the dictates of 9 wise men in robes using decoder glasses to look at all the invisible ink in the Constitution. So without glossing over the logic of the opinion or its moral and legal significance too much, they are incredibly important points, but I have spent prior time at length on both topics. I instead want to focus on some of the finer points of this now official and finalized decision. Back when the opinion leaked, we knew, of course, what Alito thought. And we knew what the other 4 justices reported to have signed on with him thought, at least that they agreed with Alito's conclusion in general. But the full opinions of all the other justices, including the presumed dissenters and especially John Roberts, remained a mystery. And it turns out that stuff is a lot more than just academic footnotes. What Thomas has to say in concurrence is especially important for understanding the competing reasoning in this case and its implications for future cases. Well, maybe some of it is just academic footnotes. Actually, calling some of it academic would be giving it far too much credit. In the case of Roberts, total bullshit footnotes is a much better descriptor. Try maybe even worse than Roe footnotes, at least in the quality of its reasoning. It is something of a surprise to see Roberts sign on to the majority opinion to make it a 6-3 decision, but Roberts only does that because he too would allow the Mississippi 15-week abortion ban at issue to stand. But of course, not because of any principle, just because of completely nonsensical, trademarked Roberts reasons. He thinks that Roe and Casey are correctly decided insofar as there is a constitutional right to an abortion, a right that should remain, Roberts says. It's just that Mississippi's law doesn't violate that right. Roberts says the viability line established in Roe and Casey was a line that never made any sense, so he would replace it with a new, even more ambiguous line of, quote, a reasonable opportunity for a woman to choose. Yeah, leave it to Roberts to replace unclear lines with even less clear ones and try to cram together incompatible ideas in a way that has nothing to do with the law and somehow find a way to piss off actually everybody in the process. Kavanaugh has a tempered and principled concurrence. agreeing with Alito's analysis that the Constitution is neutral on abortion. Where the Constitution is neutral, the court too must be neutral. Roe and Casey are not neutral, and so Roe and Casey must go. And so the issue is Mississippi's and every other state's to decide. Kavanaugh writes extra to remind everyone once again, hey guys, just so you know, we're not banning abortion. We're leaving it up to you to decide. So please take off your Handmaid's Tale costumes and double please stop trying to kill me. Breyer's dissent, joined by Kagan and Sotomayor, is exactly what you'd expect. It's another policy paper from a guy who's confused and thinks he's in Congress, not on the Supreme Court. Breyer bemoans all his forecasted bad outcomes, including poor women being unable to travel to secure abortions. Women will be raped and enslaved as child bearers while the government laughs. And Amy Coney Barrett personally whips them and tells them to pull her chariot faster to Catholic Mass, and worst of all, the states will have discretion to do stuff that Stephen Breyer personally doesn't like, as though that's a flaw and not a feature of the Constitution, and as though it's Breyer's job to evaluate if a policy choice is wise or not. It's Breyer's job to apply the constitutional text as written, and that's it. But he can't do that, and he sneers at you instead, because it's all about his wisdom and not about the law, apparently. Breyer says yesterday the Constitution protected a right to an abortion, but today it does not. No, that's just it. It never did. You made that up yesterday, and we've been playing legal pretend ever since. Breyer adds in closing that no changes in law or fact have happened, and yet the court has erased precedent anyway. But that's not the standard for overruling a case. The quality of the reasoning is. There were also no changes in law or fact when the court overruled Plessy, but I suspect Breyer wouldn't use the same reasoning to uphold the separate but equal doctrine. Anyway, the real substance of the concurrences and dissent is what Thomas has to say about substantive due process. He says there is none. Thomas's opinion is an important one, not just in what it says about this case, but for what it says about cases past and future, too. Now, to back up and define our terms, substantive due process is a legalese phrase generally used to refer to the concept of unstated or unenumerated or just implied rights in the Constitution. The idea being that the 14th Amendment's due process clause isn't just about courtroom or legislative procedure. It's not just about process of law. Due process actually entails a whole host of rights that the government can't touch because they are implicit in the concept of liberty, even if the Constitution doesn't explicitly mention them. Substantive due process is the legal theory by which the right to privacy was derived. The right to privacy was then interpreted to include a right to an abortion, among many other things throughout the last century to the present. Thomas writes separately to address this legal theory. He agrees that the Constitution contains no right to an abortion. So he agrees that the issue is properly returned to the states, but because he doesn't think substantive due process is a thing at all. The Constitution says what it says and no more. Anything else, abortion included, goes to the states. No reading between the lines. And the reasons that is massively significant are two. One, because it actually takes on significant portions of the majority reasoning in this abortion case, and two, because it calls into question a long list of prior decisions as well. If you remember Alito's majority opinion in this case, it's actually written under the framework of substantive due process. It uses the theory of substantive due process to reach its conclusion. It does not reject it. Alito says a substantive due process analysis requires looking at two things: whether the implied right under consideration, in this case abortion, is deeply rooted in the country's history, and whether the right is implicit in the concept of ordered liberty. And through a lengthy historical analysis, Alito finds neither. Alito says it's impossible to say abortion is historically rooted and implicit in liberty when at the time of Roe's decision, 30 states still prohibited abortion at all stages of pregnancy. Alito was very careful. By operating within the framework of substantive due process, granting the premise that there are implied rights, Alito's analysis is that abortion is not an implied right, though implied rights do exist. Thomas is saying right conclusion, there is no constitutional right to an abortion, but wrong reasoning, because there are no implied rights at all. That reasoning would, of course, simplify Alito's analysis drastically. Instead of a lengthy discussion about how to analyze what is and is not an implied right, the Thomas decision would read simply, it is not in the Constitution, and anything not in the Constitution properly belongs with the states. And if that is the reasoning instead, that anything not explicitly mentioned in the Constitution is not an issue for the Supreme Court to touch, well, that does have sweeping implications for a lot of Supreme Court precedent. And Thomas doesn't hide from it. He doesn't stop swinging it at just Alito's opinion in this case. He swings it at a whole series of prior cases too. Alito was very specific and deliberate to say that because substantive due process stands, so too do other rights inferred from it, like privacy, contraception, gay marriage, and others. This decision concerns only whether abortion is a substantive due process right, according to Alito, not whether prior rights identified qualify. And Thomas says, nope, all of that is bullshit. He says there's no such thing as substantive due process. It's an oxymoron that should be rejected in this case and every other. That includes cases future and cases past. Yes, Griswold, establishing the right to privacy that protected contraception, is not constitutionally sound. Yes, Lawrence v. Texas, establishing the right to gay sex, is not constitutionally sound. Yes, Obergefell, establishing a right to gay marriage, is not constitutionally sound. And Thomas's reasons are more than just the Constitution doesn't say it, though that is actually an important principle in pursuit of judicial restraint. But Thomas outlines 3 reasons why substantive due process ought to be discarded, beyond his criticism that it's all just made up. First, because it usurps power from the people and the states and concentrates it in the federal bench. It is policymaking properly reserved for the people and not neutral legal analysis, which is the proper and only constitutional role for the judiciary. Second, substantive due process distorts other constitutional provisions. Once you invent one right, you invent others on top of it, as Roe did with the right to abortion inferred through a right to privacy. And once a right is invented for one group, through the Equal Protection Clause, it is invented for others. It is an invitation and a justification for the courts to play leapfrog with the law rather than apply it as written. And third, Thomas says substantive due process leads to disastrous outcomes. When you remove power from the people on controversial issues, it creates conflict, as it did in the Civil War, or in the case of abortion, it establishes national requirements that resulted in 63 million lives taken. Now, you'll see headlines circulating all about how Thomas wants to invade your bedroom and steal all your condoms, or nullify your marriage, or become Peeping Thomas and spy on you because he doesn't believe in a right to privacy, whatever scary way they want to characterize it. But as the name substantive due process implies, this is an important question about process, not a question about outcome. Thomas does not care about your bedroom. Thomas does not care about your marriage. He writes nothing about whether he personally approves or disapproves of them. He writes everything about who should get to decide these issues. Should it be him and Breyer in their wise guy robes in D.C., or should it be you with your neighbors in your state? For all the worry that the dissent and the Roe reactionaries have about women supposedly not being able to leave their states when they disagree with the policy within it, if that's such an important principle, well, maybe to Thomas's point, we ought to preserve it. Maybe a federal government that does nothing beyond its strict constitutional assignment means more freedom, not less, because even if you do live in a place where you think your freedom is under threat, you can always go over there where it isn't. Under a system where the centralized wise robes decide, there is no over there to go to. There is one standard for everybody, rooted not in law, not in power in the people, but just in the whims of an elite few who have massaged their brains so much they've convinced themselves they are smarter than you and better than you, despite the fact that they've built their whole career supported entirely by your subsidy. If there's one thing I've learned in this entire episode, it is always be skeptical of those fear-mongering about putting political power back with you and your neighbors. It is much better to be wary of those insisting that they can manage political power on your behalf better than you can yourself, because even centralized power you agree with is actually no power at all. If you're enraged by political power returning to you, well, congrats, you have been successfully programmed. Thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel. Always appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below, and especially over on Parler. That is at ML Christiansen. You're always welcome to coming out and chatting my live streams. Those are linked down in the description. Looking forward to it. Goodbye.